Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander through the hushed stone halls of a place you've only glimpsed in dreams. Ancient Egypt, land of the golden pharaohs, lotus-scented perfumes, and teeth so ground down you probably won't survive this without cringing. Picture this. You stand by the Nile at dusk, the water warm and sluggish as it curls past the crumbling mud brick walls. Somewhere behind you, a temple priest murmurs a hymn to Ra, while in front of you, a royal scribe leans in close, and, oh dear, his breath is enough to drop a donkey. So, before you get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle along a market street near Memphis, your sandals kicking up fine golden dust that settles on rows of hard, flat loaves, the Egyptian staple, bread baked with barley, emmer wheat, and a sprinkle of grit. Those grain-grinding stones, though a marvel of Bronze Age technology, left behind sand so fine it worked itself into every bite. As you taste the bread, a gritty crunch grates against your molars. You might imagine a pharaoh feasting on lush honey cakes, but even their royal flour was loaded with pulverized stone. Historians still argue whether royal bakers were careless or simply had no better tools, but one thing's clear, those sharp grains chewed through tooth enamel like little desert knives. And then there were the dates. Picture baskets brimming with sticky, caramel-rich dates sweet enough to rot your teeth in days. Ancient Egyptians adored these sugary morsels, eating them daily, drenching them in beer, and even offering them to the gods. But under that honeyed surface lurked a dental time bomb. Sugar plus leftover gritty bread equals a perfect breeding ground for tooth decay, a relentless parade of blackened cavities lurking under royal lips. As you pass the bread stalls, the mingling scents of coriander, cumin, and crushed garlic waft over you, and you can't help but notice the children's smiles, crooked, worn, and dotted with dark holes. Their parents aren't much better, flashing the same yellowed stubs. And why wouldn't they? Ancient Egyptian diets leaned heavy on carbs, low on protective fats, and didn't exactly feature toothbrushes. Sure, some well-to-do families could pay for herbal mouth scrubs, but for most, the solution was simply to ignore the rot and hope the gods would keep their teeth from crumbling out. Of course, if you were a pharaoh, you could call for a specialist. Yet even royalty had to face the daily grind of hard bread and sticky dates. Imagine Tutankhamun, a boy barely old enough to rule, gnawing on his festival loaf, never suspecting he'd carry a mouthful of worn-down molars into eternity. Modern CT scans of mummies prove it. Even kings ended up with teeth ground flat, sometimes right down to the nerves. Makes you wonder if their crowns were for ruling, or just for hiding the toothache. And speaking of hiding, think about the royal courtiers. These men and women, hoping to catch the pharaoh's favor, had to talk close, laugh loud, and stay on the king's good side. You can practically smell the stale date breath seeping from their honey wine-stained teeth as they bow. In a world without toothpaste, your best hope was to chew a few mint leaves, or politely hold your nose. One fascinating little tidbit? They tried to polish their teeth using ground-up natron, a type of salty soda ash they also used to embalm mummies. So yes, you might have scrubbed your mouth with the same substance meant to dry out a corpse. That's one way to keep things fresh. Historians still argue whether this did more harm than good, since natron could be horribly abrasive, but it tells you just how desperate people were to fight tooth decay. As the sun lowers beyond the palace walls, you hear the quiet snap of reeds along the river. Somewhere, a fisherman picks at a bit of bread, frowning as a shard of gritty stone jabs his gum. You feel the same pain echo through the centuries, that grinding ache of sand-laced bread digging tiny holes in teeth that never quite heal. The river's muddy breath smells of silt and fish, mingling with the sweetness of fermenting dates drifting from a nearby kitchen. It's enough to make you thankful for your modern toothpaste, your soft bristles, your fluoride. Picture yourself standing there, torn between a delicious date and the horror of losing half your teeth before 30. 3,000 years later, you'd still be shaking your head. And the Pharaoh? He might have had gold, slaves, incense, and pyramids, but he didn't have a decent toothbrush. There's your bedtime reality check. You keep moving down the river road, past sellers of onions, lentils, and dried fish. A donkey brays, loud and indignant, as if protesting the taste of its own dinner. The same ancient sun that burned the wheat fields to gold also burned the enamel off a kingdom's smile. Those royal portraits you've seen in museums, serene, otherworldly, lips gently closed, probably hid a mess of blackened roots and cracked enamel behind the paint. And so you step closer to the gates of the palace, the pharaoh's teeth gleaming in their fragile imperfection, ground down from decades of worshipping sweet dates and chewing on bread filled with desert grit. You can practically hear the faint grinding, like a millstone, as he tries to smile for the gods. You pass through the palace gates, the limestone walls towering high overhead, as the sun begins to fade behind the distant desert dunes. The air here feels cooler, scented with lotus blossoms arranged in delicate garlands. Within the royal household, an entire miniature world unfolds: bustling cooks, scribes with their papyrus scrolls, linen bearers, and among them, a group of men you wouldn't expect, the pharaoh's personal dental priests. They call themselves dentists of the sun god, a prestigious group sworn to protect the king's smile just as carefully as his royal cartouche. These tooth priests, or IRYSWNW as they styled themselves, wore pristine linen kilts, their hands washed with scented water, and carried a toolkit that might look more like a torture set than anything reassuring. You can picture the polished copper chisels, long bronze hooks, obsidian scrapers, and little ivory spatulas. You're no dentist, but you sense you wouldn't survive 5 minutes in their chair. One of these men steps forward to examine a courtier's mouth, and you get close enough to smell the earthy mix of resin and beer on his breath. The tooth priest murmurs a prayer to Hathor, patron goddess of health, and then sets about probing a dark, angry cavity with a copper pick that makes you shiver. Historians still argue whether these dental priests had real surgical skills or were more like well-connected healers, protected by the aura of temple magic. But for a pharaoh, that ritual incantation was half the cure. The tools rattling in a cloth satchel would send chills down even a seasoned modern dentist's spine. The copper instruments could easily rust or bend, and there's debate today about how effective they were at removing decay. Yet the pharaoh placed total trust in them, perhaps more than he trusted his generals. After all, the ability to chew, to speak clearly in court, to smile for the public, those were powerful symbols of divine order. Rotten teeth would have been a bad omen, a crack in the pharaoh's perfection. One fringe tidbit you wouldn't expect? Some of these dentists might have doubled as embalmers. In a society obsessed with the afterlife, a man skilled in sewing up the mouth of a corpse might be equally valued for patching up the living pharaoh's rotting tooth. Imagine showing up for a cleaning and discovering your hygienist was the same person who prepped mummies down the hall. Sleep tight, dear listener. As you drift deeper into the palace complex, the chatter softens. You pause near a tiled courtyard where a child king, barely out of boyhood, waits to have his sore tooth seen. His golden headpiece glitters in the low lamplight. The boy trembles, already anticipating the rough copper pick. You can practically feel the tension, the hush that falls over the attendants as they avert their eyes from the child's pain. There was no laughing gas, no numbing injection, just a quick prayer, and then, steel against the nerve. You watch as the tooth priest scoops a brownish herbal paste from a polished bowl. He gently smears it onto the tooth, a mixture of honey, crushed herbs, and maybe a pinch of myrrh to fight infection. The sweetness masks a stinging antiseptic, strong enough to burn. Then he starts scraping, slow and steady, while the boy tries to keep still, a tear rolling down his painted cheek. The smell of scorched herbs, sweat, and copper fills the air. And here's where historians still argue. Was this paste a real treatment or mostly a placebo? Modern scholars debate whether the herbal mixtures truly helped or if the power of ritual, the whispered prayers, the dramatic gestures, was the main anesthetic. It's the same question you'd ask about snake oil today, only with a more terrifying instrument and a terrified teenage king. The walls flicker in the light of oil lamps as the boy finally relaxes, the tooth priest bowing low and thanking Hathor for her blessing. You notice the child's smile, still damaged, a little hole left behind, but no longer filled with black rot. A small victory in a kingdom where sugar was a daily poison. Around the courtyard, scribes take careful notes on the treatment, recording every step with obsessive precision. These dental logs might have been filed away in the palace library, eventually lost under centuries of sand, but they hint that Egypt took its tooth problems far more seriously than most people ever imagine. It wasn't just about health, it was about power. A pharaoh with a strong bite could command respect. A pharaoh with foul breath or gaping molars might be seen as cursed by the gods. That's why these dentists of the sun god held such high rank, sometimes even higher than royal physicians. Your ability to fix a king's mouth could determine the fate of your entire family. Success meant gifts of land and gold. Failure could mean being banished to the quarries, or worse, fed to the crocodiles that lurked along the palace's canals. Speaking of crocodiles, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from other ancient treatments? Well, these tooth priests believed in similar odd remedies. At least one recipe included ground-up crocodile teeth as a protective charm against tooth decay. A bit of animal magic, perhaps, or just a way to impress a superstitious ruler. You wonder if anyone ever actually tried to chew on crocodile teeth. As the night grows deeper, you walk the palace halls, stepping softly over reed mats, hearing a low murmur of priests chanting for health. And in the quiet corners, you catch a glimpse of tooth priests sharpening their tools, polishing copper, preparing for the next royal patient. Somewhere in those dim corridors, the next victim, royal or common, is already steeling themselves for that clumsy copper pick. The faint sound of sobbing from the courtyard reminds you that pain is eternal, as universal as the slow grinding of stone against wheat. And even for a god king on his lotus throne, there was no escaping that pain when the tooth priest came calling. You ease farther into the flickering lamplight of the palace's great hall, where priests chant in praise of Ra, and incense coils through the air. Near the base of a carved papyrus column, you catch the scent of something foul, sour and sweet, wrapped together like a half-rotten fruit. It takes a moment to realize what it is: royal bad breath, thick enough to make a donkey faint. You'd think a living god on earth would have pearly whites gleaming in the sun, right? But no, the pharaoh, just like any bricklayer or beer brewer, battled the daily horror of halitosis. His diet, heavy on onions, leeks, garlic, and of course those sugar-soaked dates, brewed up a perfect storm of bacterial funk. Historians still argue whether their herbal mouthwashes really worked or were more about ritual purity than hygiene. You slip behind a column as two court attendants approach with a clay jar. Inside, you see a paste of crushed mint, frankincense, and honey. They swirl it in the jar, then dab a bit onto their tongues, nodding as though sampling fine wine. This was one of the royal breath fresheners, meant to mask the stench rather than eliminate it. And if that didn't work, well, you'd better keep a respectful distance from your pharaoh, unless you wanted to swoon from his sacred stink. The Egyptians even used myrrh and cinnamon dissolved in beer as a kind of mouth rinse, hoping the powerful flavors would smother the rot in their gums. It sounds almost refreshing, until you remember they had no way to sterilize their tools, so each rinse might have introduced even more bacteria. One fringe tidbit suggests they sometimes flavored these rinses with crocodile bile, believing the beast's strength would guard their mouth from disease. Imagine gargling with that before heading to a dinner banquet. Sleep well with that thought. Over by the alabaster statues, a pair of high-ranking scribes gossip about a noble who apparently had breath so bad that the gods themselves turned away, at least according to a temple hymn. The story makes you grin. Even 3,000 years ago, people were roasting each other over bad breath. Some things never change. A third scribe, solemn in a blue linen kilt, explains the more formal rituals. The pharaoh had to undergo ceremonial purifications before entering a temple, and that included mouth-cleansing prayers. A priest would stand close, waving burning kifi incense while chanting words to banish demons of rot. This breath blessing was believed to drive away any spirits that might sneak into the pharaoh's body through a decayed tooth. You can practically feel the hot, heavy smoke around your face, the dry tickle in your throat as you try not to cough. And yet, in spite of all the rituals and scented herbs, the truth was brutal. The pharaoh's teeth were probably crawling with infection. Modern forensic teams studying mummies have found jaw abscesses so severe the bone was almost eaten away. It makes you wince, knowing that same king had to stand in front of his people and proclaim himself chosen by the gods. A man with a hole rotting through his jaw, still ruling by divine right. At the far end of the hall, you hear a priest explaining to a group of young novices how to prepare a fresh mouthwash batch. Crushed barley, coriander, a splash of honey, even a little donkey milk for soothing ulcers. You can only imagine the taste, somewhere between spoiled yogurt and soggy bread. Historians still argue if donkey milk truly helped or was just another elaborate placebo. There is a tender moment here, too, if you listen carefully. A servant girl, barely 15, nervously lifts a tiny cup of herbal rinse to the pharaoh himself. He takes it with a regal nod, swishes once, and grimaces, the bitterness turning his face into something very human. For just a second, the living god looks like a frightened, hurting child, terrified his mouth will betray him in front of the priests. One fringe tradition claims the pharaoh would offer a sacrifice to Tauret, the protective hippo goddess, asking her to watch over his aching teeth. You almost laugh picturing a giant, snorting hippo spirit defending a royal molar. Yet in the world of Egypt, every aspect of life, even bad breath, had a divine protector. You lean back against the cool stone, the night air drifting in from the gardens beyond. The faint perfumes cannot fully hide the tang of infected gums, a reminder of how even the mightiest kings were at the mercy of bacteria. They could build pyramids, raise armies, and tame the flooding Nile, but a tiny colony of microbes could still rule their mouths. The scribes carry away the jars of mint and honey paste, carefully sealed with lumps of clay stamped with the palace seal. Their footsteps echo through the hallway, a quiet rhythm that somehow soothes you, like a heartbeat drifting through time. Out in the courtyard, someone begins to drum, summoning a dancer for the evening's entertainment. You watch the swirl of colored linen, the clatter of ankle bells, but all you can think about is that sickly sweet breath, lingering behind the painted smiles of the court. Maybe the pharaoh himself will laugh, forget the pain, and sip a beer infused with cinnamon, praying it's enough to kill the worst of the rot. And you, dear listener, are still there, practically nose to nose with him in your imagination, catching the faint whiff of honeyed corruption beneath layers of lotus perfume. In a way, it's comforting to know that whether you rule kingdoms or just drift off to sleep, your breath will always be Well, uniquely yours. Sweet dreams of minty donkey milk, my friend. You slip from the crowded banquet hall toward a quiet alcove, where a faint breeze off the Nile stirs the rush mats underfoot. There, in a carved wooden box, you spot an object so ordinary, yet so priceless in this world, the royal toothpick. It lies alongside a row of cosmetic spoons and bronze razors, delicate as a reed, slender as a bird's leg bone. This simple sliver of polished reed was the pharaoh's best defense against the endless war on food stuck between his sand-blasted molars. If you imagine gold-flecked tools worthy of a god-king, think again. The most common toothpicks were humble reeds or even palm thorns, scraped clean and reused until they splintered. In the homes of high courtiers, a bronze pick might appear, elegant and faintly green with the patina of age, but still primitive next to your modern dental floss. Historians still argue whether these bronze toothpicks were ceremonial props or genuinely functional, given how soft copper alloys could bend. Yet they were a status symbol all the same, tucked into the folds of a noble's belt like a modern phone. You ease closer, imagining yourself plucking a date seed from your teeth with a pointed reed, worrying that a slip might jab your gums and let an infection in. Those infections, after all, were no joke. In a society without antibiotics, a simple gum wound could fester, spreading through the blood and taking down a pharaoh before his next festival. Cheery bedtime thought, right? There's something almost tender about the way these toothpicks were stored, wrapped in linen or slipped inside tiny clay jars to keep them clean. You see a servant carefully unwrapping one, testing the sharpness against a fingernail, then presenting it to the young pharaoh with a bow. The pharaoh's lips tighten as he probes a chunk of gritty bread lodged behind a molar, and you sense the quiet desperation behind that regal mask. After all, no one wanted to address the gods with a half-rotted chunk of barley bread in their teeth. One fringe tidbit: some nobles dipped their toothpicks in resin or even frankincense oil, hoping to kill off the stink of spoiled food. You picture that warm, sticky resin coating the pick, perhaps leaving a faintly pleasant aftertaste, though it would have stained your gums brownish yellow. Historians still debate if the resin had any real antibacterial power or was just an expensive perfume for your mouth. Over by the painted columns, two scribes squabble about which household had the best toothpicks, the way modern people brag about fancy watches or sports cars. One claims a reed from the marshes of Fayum was strongest, another swears by a Nubian palm thorn, flexible and smooth. You can't help but smile at how human this is. Even 3,500 years ago, people argued over the best tools for picking gunk from their teeth. A breeze picks up, rattling the woven shutters, and you catch a glimpse of the pharaoh himself leaning on a carved stool. His face is pained, one cheek slightly swollen, but he still motions to a servant for his toothpick. The moment feels weirdly intimate, a living god fussing over a bit of stuck barley. Yet he uses the pick like a warrior with a spear, determined to drive out the invading bread before it rots. As you follow the pharaoh's gaze, you spot a few priests observing him, making sure no one notices the little spasm of pain. To show weakness in front of the wrong witness could be dangerous. Rumors might spread: the pharaoh was unclean, unfit, cursed by some god. And so, these small grooming tools became political props as much as dental ones, part of the careful image management that kept a dynasty afloat. One servant sweeps up the discarded toothpicks, carrying them off to be burned in a small clay pot. Even these humble sticks were considered contaminated and had to be ritually destroyed. You watch the tiny flames lick around them, hear the faint hiss of resin, and think how those charred reeds carried a kingdom's secrets. There's a moment of dark humor as a young boy, maybe no older than 12, breaks his toothpick in half while cleaning a tooth, then tries to hide the pieces under his sash. No one wants to be scolded for wasting the royal supply. You feel a pang of sympathy. At least you don't have to worry about a pharaoh's toothpick shortage before bedtime. The night deepens, cool and starshot above the palace walls, as you drift among rows of baskets stuffed with more reeds, ready for tomorrow's rituals. Out in the darkness, you can hear a boatman calling through the river reeds, his voice carrying across the water. Even he, come nightfall, will pull a humble sliver of reed from behind his ear to clean his aching teeth, just like the king. That image stays with you, floating on the Nile's slow breath. Rich or poor, crowned or barefoot, everyone had to pick grit from their teeth after a long day in the desert kingdom. A tiny reed became a bridge between gods and mortals, between power and vulnerability, reminding you that no one, no matter how mighty, escapes the daily grime. You take one last look at that royal toothpick, laid back in its carved wooden box, glinting faintly in the lamplight. So small, so delicate, yet it held the power to save a pharaoh's smile, or let it rot. And for now, in this night of drifting dreams, you feel oddly reassured by that simple, human struggle. The Nile wind grows stronger, stirring the palace awnings as you move deeper into the heart of the royal kitchens. The air is thick with the smell of yeast, honey, and a whisper of crushed barley, carrying you back to the beating heart of pharaonic daily life: bread. You stand at the edge of a great grinding room, where women and boys bend over low quern stones, pounding out dough day and night, turning grain into the loaves that fed an empire and wrecked its teeth. It's hard to overstate how vital bread was. Egyptians worshipped it almost like a sacred blessing, calling it the staff of life, offering loaves to gods and ancestors alike. But the same bread, milled on sandstone slabs, carried the curse of countless tiny grit particles. You lean down, peeking into a basket of raw flour, and run your fingers through its powdery surface. Almost instantly, you feel the rough edges of ground stone. That flour, eaten every day, worked its slow, cruel damage on every tooth in Egypt, from the pharaoh to the humblest field hand. Historians still argue whether the grinding stones could have been improved, or if the Egyptians simply accepted the damage as the price of cheap food. The querns ground grain perfectly fine, but they also shed bits of quartz and sandstone, invisible to the naked eye, which acted like microscopic sandpaper on enamel. So when a pharaoh took a bite of his honey cake, he was also biting into tiny, unstoppable enemies that would grind his molars to flat yellow stubs before middle age. And then there was the grain itself. Stored for months in open-air granaries, exposed to wind, rodents, and insects, it often arrived riddled with grit from desert dust storms. You can almost taste it, gritty on your tongue, the faint bite of sand between your teeth, a harsh, relentless flavor that even a sweet date could never fully hide. Over in the next courtyard, you spot a young woman trying to knead dough while a toddler pulls at her belt. She sighs, adding more water to the sticky mass, and then pushes in a bit of honey. Even the pharaoh's bakers needed honey to soften their gritty bread. A fringe practice suggested by one scribe was to rinse the flour with river water first, hoping the heavier sand would settle to the bottom. But in a kingdom constantly at war with drought, wasting water on rinsing flour was unthinkable. As you wander among the baking ovens, you see rows of date cakes, barley loaves, and even emmer wheat bread stacked like precious cargo. The scent is rich, earthy, familiar. Yet you know the pharaoh himself will pay the price in pain, that same dull ache boring through every tooth as he chews. One scholar described ancient Egyptian bread as fossilized breakfast, which feels about right once you imagine those grains of quartz grinding their way between the royal crowns. You move along a line of women shaping dough with surprisingly modern skill, forming it into tiny animal figures meant as temple offerings. Some historians still argue whether these offering breads were eaten after ceremonies or discarded. If they were eaten, you can bet they were just as gritty and tooth-shredding as daily loaves. A copper pot bubbles nearby, honey and beer reduced into a thick syrup for flavoring bread. The warm scent soothes you, but the thought of sugar swirling around teeth already shredded by grit is enough to send a shiver down your spine. Picture a pharaoh trying to smile with molars worn flat, cavities yawning under the enamel, all while commanding armies and building temples. Even a god-king could not command the stones to stop biting him back. One courtier, you overhear, boasts that his family imported a cleaner flour from the delta, claiming it was less sandy. Of course, it was twice as expensive, and commoners never saw a crumb. Yet even that luxury flour probably carried enough quartz to slowly ruin a mouth. The courtier flashes a half-rotten grin to prove it. You pass the brick ovens, heat roaring out in short, sharp gusts. The bakers shield their faces with bits of damp linen, eyes squinting against the glare. You imagine them, hour after hour, inhaling flour dust that carried 1,000 tiny blades, every breath a reminder that food and pain were inseparable in this world. Out beyond the bakery, you spot a priest blessing a shipment of grain, another attempt to keep rot and evil spirits away. They believed sickness had its own malevolent presence, and blessing the bread could somehow protect the pharaoh's teeth from the invisible curses of decay. You can almost hear the priest's chant, low and steady, as if he could command away cavities with the name of Osiris. Still, even prayers could not polish away stone grit. It was everywhere, as much a part of ancient Egypt as pyramids and river mud. As you walk through the doorway into a courtyard, you feel the crunch of sand under your own sandals, a quiet echo of that same deadly grit hiding in every royal loaf. And so, as the stars rise above the palace, you picture the pharaoh trying to rest, his jaws aching from the daily meal, a dull throb reminding him that no matter how divine he might appear, his kingdom's bread still carried the taste of stone. For now, you let that gritty flavor fade, soothing your mind with the slow, even breath of the Nile drifting outside. You slip past a row of sleeping servants into a shadowed side chapel, where a faint light dances on polished limestone walls. Here, the air is cooler, scented with a heady mix of myrrh and frankincense, curling around your nostrils in a way that almost soothes your nerves. Almost. Because as you step closer, you see the priest carefully laying out a set of small, ominous objects. Amulets shaped like crocodiles, serpents, and open mouths, each one designed to protect the pharaoh's teeth from curses, demons, or even tooth-gnawing spirits. This is where dental magic took its place beside copper tools. The pharaoh's priests, ever wary of anything that might undermine the king's health, designed spells as carefully as his embalmers wrapped his mummy. They believed that rot could start from the breath of an evil spirit. So you might place a little wax figurine of a crocodile on a shrine, then chant to drive away toothed demons who gnawed at your enamel while you slept. Historians still argue whether these charms were meant to supplement real treatment or simply distract from the hopeless pain. A gentle breeze flutters the linen curtains as a priest recites lines from a papyrus scroll. O mouth, be cleansed, be pure, do not rot, do not swell. His voice echoes off the hard floor, steady as the Nile's current. If you listen closely, you can almost believe it. Some fringe scholars claim certain incantations worked like hypnotic therapy, calming the patient enough to endure primitive cleaning with copper picks and reed toothpicks. In a way, the spell was its own sort of painkiller. You ease closer to watch as a priest paints a protective eye on a small ceramic jar. Inside, he places dried herbs, mint, perhaps, or thyme, and a slip of papyrus with a written prayer to Hathor. The jar will stand by the pharaoh's bed, warding off mouth rot while he sleeps. They believed that at night, demons crept in through the unguarded breath, laying waste to gums and teeth. A little jar like this was meant to slam that doorway shut. By the flickering flame, you see another odd practice: a servant grinding blue-green malachite into powder, mixing it with honey and a dash of wine. This paste would be dabbed onto an infected tooth as both a healing agent and a magical ward. Of course, malachite is copper ore, so in theory it had some antibacterial power, though too much could poison you. Still, the pharaoh trusted the gods would strike the perfect balance. Sleep well with that thought. In the corner of the shrine, a young boy repeats a rhyme over and over, lips moving silently, his eyes squeezed shut. He's memorizing the mouth spells so that he might one day serve the pharaoh, preserving not only his ruler's soul but also his ability to chew. It's almost touching, this dedication to something as simple and as vital as eating without agony. You wander through rows of tiny statues shaped like open mouths, carved from alabaster and faience. Each one was meant to keep the pharaoh's teeth strong, a pledge to the gods of health. Sometimes a priest would whisper a special verse into the pharaoh's ear while gently tapping his jaw, as if the verse itself could carry healing straight into the bone. Historians still argue whether that was placebo or true faith medicine, but there's no doubt it offered a measure of comfort in a world where tooth decay could easily mean death. A fringe tradition even involved placing a tiny gold plate beneath the tongue while reciting a healing chant. Gold was thought to hold divine power, drawn from the eternal sun. So putting it near a rotten tooth might, in their eyes, invite a spark of godly energy to drive out the rot. Of course, you can imagine the risk of accidentally swallowing it in your sleep. Talk about gilded nightmares. Back near the shrine's doorway, the priests finish their last chant and file out, leaving behind a hush that wraps around you like soft linen. You can still sense the deep fear that hung over the pharaoh and his priests, the fear that a rotting tooth might be a crack in his divine armor. If the king could not even keep his mouth whole, how could he claim the favor of the gods? In the quiet, you step toward a painted relief showing the goddess Sekhmet, her lioness face fierce, poised to rip disease from a worshipper's body. You wonder if the pharaoh sometimes prayed to her as he lay awake, a dull ache gnawing through his jaw. No matter how many charms he kept by his bed, no matter how many crocodile tooth amulets he wore, there would still be those long, sleepless nights. And tonight, in the silence of your own room, with the breeze of a quiet fan in the background, maybe you can sympathize. Because even in our modern world, the fear of toothache still haunts our dreams. You let that realization settle into your mind, a gentle, if somewhat alarming, comfort that reminds you pain and hope have always been neighbors. You wander away from the shrine, past the flickering glow of oil lamps, and into a small tiled chamber where the air feels almost painfully clean. A basin of fresh water stands ready, its surface scented with lotus petals and thyme, while rows of copper tools gleam beneath the lamplight. Here, you glimpse the beginnings of something both ingenious and terrifying: the pharaoh's earliest experiments with dental fillings and supports, centuries before modern dentistry was even a dream. A servant stands ready with thin strands of hammered gold, delicate enough to braid through teeth like jewelry. Gold wire could be threaded around loose molars to stabilize them, a primitive attempt at a dental splint. Historians still argue whether these wires were actually used to chew again, or were more a cosmetic fix to keep the royal smile intact. Imagine biting into a chunk of bread with gold bands wrapped around a wobbly molar. Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive that first crunch. But the pharaoh's healers were nothing if not creative. One fringe recipe called for donkey milk, mixed with herbs, as a mouth rinse meant to soothe swollen gums. Picture the sour, tangy taste of donkey milk sloshing around teeth that were already half-rotten. Sweet dreams about that. Yet it was cherished, believed to have healing power from the goddess Hathor herself, who was sometimes linked with the protective force of milk. You stand close enough to see a copper pick being heated over a lamp, its tip glowing faintly red. The priest-dentist steadies his hand, a muttered prayer to Anubis on his lips, before probing into a cavity. You can practically hear the faint crackle as infection sizzles under the copper. The pain must have been blinding, but the pharaoh would have held still, believing the gods demanded it. After all, even the mighty had no other option if they wanted to keep their jaw. And sometimes, that cavity would be packed with a thick herbal paste after being scraped. Honey, ground barley husk, and resin made a crude filling, sticky, gritty, and far from sterile. You wonder how long such a filling might last. Historians still debate that, though evidence from mummies suggests it was more for ritual than any lasting cure. In one quiet corner, a young apprentice dips a reed pen into ink, copying down recipes on a pale scrap of papyrus. His writing is painstakingly neat, each sign flowing into the next. You lean closer to read it, instructions for a gum rinse with myrrh, thyme, and, curiously, beer. Beer was thought to numb pain a little, though you suspect it was more about making the patient too tipsy to scream. Nearby, a tray of tiny copper tweezers gleams. These were used to remove bits of decayed tooth, one fragment at a time, sometimes over several days if the damage was too deep. You imagine the pharaoh, pacing his chambers, dreading each fresh round of copper-pinching torture. It makes you grateful for your dentist's gentle little mirror and mint-flavored polish. Another odd practice. Some tooth priests tried to rub powdered malachite on the gums, hoping the copper would fight infection. A fine idea in theory, except malachite is toxic in large doses. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated risk or an act of desperation. After all, a rotting tooth could kill a king just as surely as an invading army. In the far corner, a row of small jars lines a shelf. Donkey milk, again, mixed with honey and wax to form a balm. The priest-dentist stirs it carefully, then dips a carved ivory spatula to apply it to a blackened molar. The warm, waxy blend coats the infection, maybe sealing it off for a few days, giving the pharaoh a moment of peace before the ache returned. And here comes a fringe legend. Some scribes recorded that royal dentists would chant to Hathor while weaving the gold wires, believing the goddess would steady their hands. They thought her divine calm could pass through the gold into the tooth, creating a kind of sacred splint. A nice bedtime detail, gold as a conduit for a goddess's grace. The flicker of the lamp throws shadows on the priest's lined face as he checks his work. You see the faintest relief in the pharaoh's posture, as if he can finally close his mouth without fear. It won't last, you know that, but for one precious evening, the king of Egypt can smile without agony. You leave the chamber as the night deepens, lotus-scented breezes drifting in through high stone lattices. The copper tools have been cleaned and wrapped in linen, laid gently into baskets ready for tomorrow. There's a hush in the air, almost sacred, as if every soul here is hoping the pharaoh's teeth will hold for just one more sunrise. And as you step out onto the terrace, looking across the broad, dark Nile, you realize that all these splints, bombs, prayers, and wires served one purpose: to keep the pharaoh's voice strong. In a world where speaking was power, where commands meant life or death, losing your voice to a toothache was unthinkable. No wonder they wrapped their molars in gold. You leave the tiled clinic behind, letting its copper tools and donkey milk bombs fade into the darkness, and move deeper into the palace where a new sound reaches your ears, the low, muffled cries of a patient enduring something far worse than a cleaning, a tooth extraction. You creep forward into a high-ceilinged side room, walls painted with protective gauze, where a royal dentist is preparing to remove a molar too rotten to save. A hush has fallen, the kind of hush you hear before a great storm, broken only by the shuffle of linen slippers. You see the patient, not a pharaoh tonight, but a high noble, seated with hands clenched tight around a reed mat, sweat shining on his forehead. The dentist, steady as a scribe writing prayers, approaches with a tool that looks more like a tiny crowbar than anything you'd trust near your mouth. It's a bronze tooth elevator, used to lever the tooth out of the swollen jaw. Historians still argue whether these elevators were properly designed to loosen teeth, or were simply repurposed chisels. Either way, you sense the pain will be biblical. A priest mutters invocations to Sekhmet, hoping the lioness goddess will spare the patient from deadly infection. You can almost hear the rhythm of the chant, low, steady, a steadying lullaby for an act of blunt force. A fringe detail says the priest might even splash a drop of beer in the patient's mouth first, an ancient sedative, as close to anesthesia as they could get. Still, your stomach clenches at the thought of what happens next. The dentist braces himself, fits the bronze blade to the base of the molar, and starts to twist. A sharp cracking noise echoes across the chamber, making you flinch. Blood seeps around the tooth as it loosens, the patient stifling a howl. Then one last wrench, a final prayer, and the rotten tooth comes free, roots still attached, red and angry. Sleep tight, imagining that moment. You glance at the tooth, blackened, pitted, almost crumbling, and understand why it had to come out. An abscess left untreated could have traveled through the bloodstream, killing a noble just as easily as a plague. In that sense, these brutal extractions saved lives, even if they also felt like torture. The healer presses a ball of linen soaked in honey into the fresh wound. Honey, after all, was their wonder drug, a natural antibiotic that might keep infection at bay for a while. The taste of copper, blood, and honey must have been unforgettable, a memory burned into the noble's mind forever. There is something heartbreaking in the way the dentist bows afterward, apologizing for the pain with a murmured prayer. You see him close his eyes, whispering to the gods for forgiveness. Maybe, even after so many extractions, these tooth priests were still haunted by the knowledge that their healing looked more like butchery than mercy. On a side table, you notice another toolkit, lined with bronze chisels, obsidian knives, and polished mallets. They weren't there for fun, they were needed when a tooth broke mid-extraction. If the roots stayed buried, they might have to break open the jawbone to finish the job. Historians still debate whether any patient survived those surgeries, or if the bone cutting was more hopeful than realistic. Either way, the risk of infection loomed over every swing of that mallet. One fringe practice involved calling on Bes, a dwarf god with a lion's mane and bulging eyes, to guard against tooth pain. Some believed he could chase away evil spirits hiding in the gums. A small statue of Bes, painted bright red, stands on the window ledge, its fierce face keeping silent vigil over the room. As the dentist finishes wrapping the extracted tooth in linen, to be buried ceremonially in the desert later, you realize these people saw a rotting tooth not just as disease, but as a spiritual threat. Letting it linger could invite the collapse of an entire family line. So they disposed of pulled teeth like dangerous relics, away from both human homes and the king's presence. The patient sags in the chair, eyes wet, breathing ragged. A servant hands him a cup of beer laced with herbs, a small comfort against the throbbing void where a tooth once lived. Outside the window, the night air feels impossibly calm, the river breathing its slow lullaby. And so you slip back into the corridor, leaving the scene behind but not quite able to shake it. Even for a noble, even for someone wrapped in gold jewelry and perfumed linen, the agony of a decayed tooth was raw and unavoidable. The pharaoh himself would face that same terror if infection ever overwhelmed the copper picks and prayers. You walk softly, the sound of sandals on polished stone echoing around you, and imagine how fragile the body could feel when your own mouth turned against you. One tooth gone might mean a lifetime of soft gruel instead of honey cakes, and a voice that trembled rather than commanded. The stakes were no less than survival. So tonight, as you breathe easy in your own bed, spare a sleepy thanks for every dentist who uses a gentle mirror instead of a bronze crowbar. The journey through ancient teeth is far from over, but for now, you can rest your jaws, content in the knowledge that tomorrow's breakfast won't include a side of tooth-cracking quartz. You leave behind the copper crowbars and honey-soaked linen, drifting into a quieter chamber where the scent of perfumed oil and fresh-cut reeds greets you like a softer dream. Here, under low torchlight, the Pharaoh's personal physician oversees something even more ambitious than toothpicks or fillings: attempts to treat jaw infections before they could spread through the blood and kill. In a world without penicillin, the best weapon they had was honey, again, nature's golden antibiotic. And so you watch as a healer unrolls a small linen pouch, revealing dark honey infused with herbs like thyme, frankincense, and crushed garlic. The paste smells sharp, earthy, almost sweet enough to fool you into thinking it might help. He uses a bronze spoon to pack this sticky balm deep against a swollen gum line, where pus has pooled under a broken molar. It's a moment of calm before a storm you know is coming. One courtier peeks in, nose wrinkling. "Will it work?" he asks. The healer only shrugs, because historians still argue whether these honeys truly cured infections or just soothed them long enough for nature, or luck, to finish the fight. A fringe detail you might appreciate: sometimes the honey balm was mixed with a little powdered bread mold, what we now recognize as a cousin to penicillin. There's a chance this folk medicine really did help, in a tiny accidental way, centuries before modern science explained why. You can almost see the healer's grin as he sprinkles the mold in, calling it the blessing of Hathor. You watch the Pharaoh lean back against a carved headrest, eyes half closed, while the balm is packed into the angry red pocket at his gum. A quiet whimper breaks from his lips. No kingly mask this time, only a man fighting the agony of rot in his bones. The priest standing nearby begins a protective chant, repeating the name of Sekhmet. Her lioness strength was called on to burn away the poisons. He taps the Pharaoh's jaw lightly, hoping the goddess will hear and spare him the horror of blood infection. It's a gentle, almost childlike moment, a god-king comforted like any other mortal. The room is hushed but tense. You can practically feel everyone willing the infection to back down, willing the honey to hold. They know if the abscess bursts inside, spreading infection through the royal blood, there will be no coming back. The death of a pharaoh was never just a personal tragedy, it threatened the entire cosmic balance. In the corner, you glimpse a small copper blade, stained from use. If the balm fails, they might try to lance the abscess, slicing the gum open so the pus can drain. No anesthesia, of course, only a prayer and a quick cut. You feel a chill run through you, imagining that hot, pounding pain. Sleep well thinking of it, if you can. One of the younger apprentices approaches, carrying a clay cup of beer. The Pharaoh swishes it around, numbing his gums with the strong brew. Beer as mouthwash might sound ridiculous, but in this moment, it was the closest thing to courage they could offer. Outside, you hear a night chorus of frogs croaking by the river, a reminder that life keeps flowing even as the king struggles to hold on to his. The honey paste is sealed with a scrap of linen, tied gently around the tooth to keep it in place overnight. The healer bows low, stepping back, and the Pharaoh finally breathes. Short, ragged, but at least for now, alive. There's a kind of collective exhale across the room, as if the entire palace has been holding its breath. One scribe steps forward to record the treatment, carefully listing the honey, the herbs, the prayer. These records might have survived for centuries, buried in temple archives, waiting to be rediscovered under the desert's drifting sands. A fringe legend whispers that if the balm worked, the tooth would be buried with offerings, its rot banished, so the pharaoh's soul could rest in eternity free of pain. That makes you smile in a bittersweet way. Even a tooth was worthy of a funeral rite in this land of grand beliefs. As the torches sputter lower, you step back from the scene, letting the night air wash over you. The sounds of the river beyond the palace walls steady your heart, a soft rhythm that feels safer than any copper blade. And you marvel again at how a kingdom so powerful, so skilled in stone and gold, still had to fear the creeping poison of a tooth infection. For the pharaoh, it was the single biggest threat no army could defeat, a tiny pocket of rot, lurking in the shadows of his smile. You breathe out slowly, letting that reminder settle over you, comforting in its strange way. Pain makes all of us human, even the living gods. You move out from the hush of the honeybomb chamber and follow the drifting notes of a harp, echoing through the pharaoh's private quarters. Here, the walls are decorated with scenes of triumph, enemies vanquished, gods bestowing crowns, but you can't help noticing one thing missing from the painted splendor: the agony of toothache. After all, no royal mural would dare show the divine ruler grimacing in pain, clutching his jaw like a commoner. Yet inside these walls, the reality is impossible to hide. The pharaoh sits on a cushioned stool, the outlines of pain still visible around his eyes, even under the thick black coal. A healer brings forward another set of tools, lined up like soldiers: copper spatulas, resin pastes, even a bronze hook meant to scrape food stuck in swollen gums. You feel a cold shiver at the sight. Historians still argue whether these tools were properly cleaned, or if their ritual washing with natron, a kind of desert salt, was enough to keep them safe. The healer begins to work, using the hook to gently lift bits of old bread from infected gum pockets. You catch the earthy, slightly sour smell of barley and meat stuck there for days. The pharaoh flinches. It's a raw moment, painfully human, and you almost want to look away. A priest beside him murmurs soothing words to Anubis, calling for protection against demons of decay. One fringe belief claimed that a rotting tooth could actually house a malicious spirit, that every cavity was a doorway for curses. And so the prayers were as crucial as the tools, a double-layer defense against the hidden enemies lurking in the royal mouth. The healer applies a fresh paste, thick with honey and garlic, to the angry gums. The honey to heal, the garlic to fight rot, and the prayer to seal it all together. The scent is powerful, almost enough to sting your own eyes. You watch the pharaoh close his mouth around it, trying to look dignified with sticky paste leaking between royal lips. Somewhere in the distance, the harp still plays, and for a moment, it almost soothes the harsh, metallic taste. You sense how desperately the pharaoh wants to believe this will work, that tomorrow he will wake without pain, able to smile before his people and speak the words that bind the world together. Because if a pharaoh could not command his voice, how could he command anything at all? A courtier leans closer, worried. He asks if the treatment will succeed. The healer shrugs. Historians still debate how many of these pastes truly worked, and how many were simply wishful thinking, kept alive by the power of belief alone. The pharaoh, for all his glory, had to gamble every time he let these mixtures into his mouth. You notice a curious fringe tidbit on a small reed mat, a necklace strung with what looks like tiny animal teeth. One servant quietly explains it is meant to scare away spirits of decay. These teeth, taken from sacrificed cattle, symbolized strength, and by wearing them, the pharaoh hoped to keep his own teeth strong. It seems almost childish, yet heartbreakingly sincere. The healer dabs away excess honey and checks the gum pockets again. Underneath, you see bone beginning to peek through, the gums so receded that the pharaoh's jar itself is exposed. You wince, knowing that infection here could spread to the skull, a death sentence no god could reverse. Yet still, the harp plays. A gentle, mesmerizing loop that soothes the tension in the room, slows the royal breathing, and somehow makes the pain bearable. You wonder if that was the true magic, not copper or honey, but the music, distracting a suffering mind long enough to keep living. One of the priestly attendants lights another cone of incense, letting the fragrant smoke coil around the pharaoh's head. The blend is kifi, a complex mix of frankincense, raisins, wine, and herbs, used to chase away evil spirits. The scent is thick, sweet, a kind of royal perfume for a rotting mouth. As the night stretches on, you notice how the pharaoh's shoulders sag with relief, even if the pain still lingers. Maybe just knowing he was being treated, that people cared enough to chant, to soothe, to protect, was comfort enough to hold him together. You leave him there, half drifting into sleep, the harp's lullaby wrapping him like a soft linen sheet. The resin paste will harden overnight, sealing off the worst of the rot for a few precious hours. And in that small, fragile piece, the living god can dream of golden fields, calm river breezes, and teeth strong enough to bite into the next sunrise. As you step back into the hallway, the hush of the palace returns. A faint breeze stirs through open windows, carrying the river's cool breath. You let it wash over you, remembering how even the pharaoh, a man worshipped as divine, was still at the mercy of toothache, forced to trust herbs, prayers, and a gentle harp song. And maybe, in that simple truth, there is something deeply reassuring. Whether you command armies or just drift off to sleep tonight, you too can find comfort in a lullaby and a hope for tomorrow's peace. You follow the breeze out of the private quarters and into a long gallery where sunlight slants through high, lattice-carved windows. In this lighter space, the mood shifts, for here the pharaoh's scribes work tirelessly to record every treatment, every ache, every hopeful cure. Rows of scrolls and tablets preserve his dental struggles, woven among records of harvests, taxes, and conquests. Because in this land, no detail of the king's well-being was too small to archive. You pause beside a scribe, his reed pen dancing across a strip of fresh papyrus. He notes down the application of garlic honey, the prayers to Sekhmet, even the number of gold wires wrapped around molars. Historians still argue whether these records were true medical notes or ritual bragsheets to prove the pharaoh's divine perfection. But either way, they built a kind of paper trail through royal agony, a witness to pain most would rather forget. Near the window, another scribe copies charms designed to guard against toothed demons. Little sketches of open jaws appear in the margins, inked with a careful hand. You smile at their almost cartoonish look, tiny fanged spirits being chased off by copper hooks and sacred hieroglyphs. It's a reminder of how these ancient people tried to explain the unstoppable rot that no god seemed able to banish. A fringe idea floats up here too. Some texts hint that if a royal tooth fell out, it was to be stored in a special jar for later burial with the king's mummy, ensuring he had all his teeth in the afterlife. You imagine the grim joke, a second set of dentures, forever traveling with the pharaoh's spirit, so he could feast in eternity without shame. You slip closer to a third scribe, younger, eyes bright with concentration. He's sketching a diagram of the pharaoh's mouth, showing where teeth had rotted, where they'd been removed, where golden bands still held the line. It looks eerily like a modern dental chart, though framed in divine symbols instead of sterile checklists. He pauses, dips the pen again, and adds a prayer alongside the diagram. May the mouth be whole, may the words be strong. Because for a ruler, teeth meant more than eating, they were the tools of command, the gateway of speech. A rotting tooth could swallow a pharaoh's authority, along with his smile. You glance across the gallery, where a boy apprentices in the art of grinding pigments for ink. Bits of red ochre, carbon black, and malachite powder swirl together, destined for 100 scrolls telling the pharaoh's dental saga. That very ink might survive for centuries, pressed between layers of linen and resin, only to reappear under a modern archaeologist's floodlamp. One courtier steps in, asking if the newest prayers have been copied yet. He looks worried, because if the pharaoh's infection grew worse, there would be a power vacuum to fill, 1,000 rivals ready to test the throne. Even the faintest rumor of toothache could set off conspiracies. You sense the tension, the political stakes bound up in the royal jaw. Near the doorway, another scroll rests half-finished, listing every food the pharaoh had eaten: honeycakes, dates, barley bread, bits of fish. It's a quiet forensic record, meant to track what might have caused or worsened the rot. One scribe even notes how grit from the grindstones seemed worse last month, maybe explaining a spike in toothaches among the household. That's a kind of proto-science, a glimpse of rational thinking layered on top of magic and prayer. A fringe rumor in the margins suggests the pharaoh sometimes refused his own favorite bread, terrified of its quartz-filled bite, surviving on date paste and beer alone until the pain faded. You imagine his frustration, king of everything, yet humbled by a loaf of gritty bread. As you wander past tall jars of ink and bundles of fresh papyrus, you feel the quiet hope in these records. Each careful line, each diagram, each tiny spell was a prayer in itself. Let him live, let his mouth stay strong. There is a deep tenderness in that, a collective devotion to protect not just a ruler, but a father, a brother, a husband, a man whose voice kept the kingdom whole. The breeze from the river drifts in, stirring the pages, carrying the faint scent of lotus from the palace gardens. It's almost peaceful, this moment among ink and prayers, as though the scribes have woven a protective spell out of their own words. You let the sounds of reed pens scratching lull you for a moment, breathing slow and easy, comforted by the knowledge that even in an age of copper blades and donkey milk, there were people who tried to record the truth, however painful. And maybe, in the end, that truth was the greatest magic of all. The belief that even the smallest details, the tiniest pains, deserved to be remembered. You step back toward the stone hallway, leaving the scribes to their sacred duty, and feel a sleepy gratitude for every written word that carried these secrets forward in time. A tooth, after all, was more than bone. It was a symbol of a ruler's power, a piece of immortality, a silent partner in the story of Egypt itself. You step away from the scratching pens and out into a small colonnaded courtyard where the breeze carries a gentler calm. Here, the healers gather to rest after their long night tending to royal teeth. The scent of lotus floats from shallow pools, mingling with the smell of warm bread from the kitchens nearby. For a moment, you let your shoulders loosen, listening to the quiet murmur of water and the soft conversations of men and women who have seen more pain than most could bear. Among them, an elderly priest leans against a limestone pillar, retelling the story of the pharaoh's worst toothache. You catch bits and pieces, how the swelling was so fierce it nearly sealed the king's jaw shut, how even beer couldn't dull the pain, how the entire palace trembled until the healer finally lanced the abscess. Historians still argue whether that dramatic event truly threatened the kingdom, or if the priests exaggerated it to make their intervention seem heroic. One apprentice, barely grown, listens with wide eyes. The elder explains how the priestly staff made protective amulets, tiny crocodiles, open mouths, and sacred eyes, to hang above the pharaoh's bed. Those talismans, he claims, guarded the royal mouth against demons eager to slip through cracked enamel and steal his power. It sounds fantastical, but then again, pain makes believers of us all. A fringe rumor slips into the tale, that one desperate healer tried to charm a snake's tooth, grinding it into powder and mixing it with honey for a final, risky treatment. You raise an eyebrow. Surely they didn't. But then again, Egypt was a place where magic and medicine danced together, inseparable, each giving the other strength. In the shade of the portico, a small group of children play a game with painted stones, laughing, shouting. One points to a tooth painted on his stone and calls it the Pharaoh's curse, pretending to faint dramatically. Their carefree voices remind you how even something terrifying can become a playground joke, a way to tame fear. You look back toward the priest, who has begun explaining how they taught even the Pharaoh to chew more gently, urging him to favor soft dates, honey cakes soaked in beer, and stewed lentils rather than the dreaded grit-laden bread. The elder shakes his head, half laughing, recalling how the king sometimes ignored this advice out of sheer royal stubbornness, a reminder that divine or not, the Pharaoh could still be a terrible patient. They talk of how these gentle foods were carried up in baskets, draped with linen to keep off the desert dust, as though every meal was a fragile treasure. It had to be, since one careless bite might split a tooth beyond saving. The image makes you wince. Soft food, wrapped like a gift, to preserve a single decaying molar, a strange luxury, but the price of holding power. By the pool's edge, an apprentice unrolls a fresh length of linen, soaking it in cool water before gently dabbing his own sore gums. You can practically feel the relief of that moment, even for someone not royal, a small mercy in a world with so few. One of the older healers nods approval, encouraging the practice. There was wisdom in it, even if no copper tool or prayer could truly cure the rot underneath. In a quiet moment, you catch sight of a group of singers rehearsing for a temple festival. Their voices rise and fall, smooth as the ripples on the pool's surface. It's almost hypnotic. You sense why the Pharaoh would have kept musicians close whenever a tooth flared up, because sound itself was a balm. It reminded him of normal life, a world beyond infection and pain. Historians still debate how effective these courtyards were in helping the Pharaoh recover, whether fresh air and music actually sped healing, or simply gave the illusion of peace. But you suspect that illusion alone was powerful enough. After all, hope can numb pain in ways copper hooks never could. Nearby, a small jar of honey stands, waiting to be warmed. Its golden gleam under the courtyard sun seems almost divine, a link to a world beyond hurt. One apprentice reaches for it, testing its thickness between thumb and finger, maybe imagining how it might soothe the next royal crisis. You take a breath, feeling the sunlight on your skin, letting that honeyed calm drift through you. Here, in this moment of rest, you understand that the Pharaoh's healing was never just about tools and herbs. It was about faith, patience, and the kindness of those who stayed up night after night, chanting and mixing and hoping for relief. And as the breeze from the Nile brushes past, you let it remind you that even the greatest among us must pause to rest, to let the body mend, to trust in the small comforts of a cool cloth or a sweet melody. The Pharaoh, mighty as he was, needed these things just like you. Soft foods, soft songs, and the quiet promise that tomorrow might hurt a little less. You leave the sunny courtyard behind and slip through a narrow door into the Pharaoh's personal storerooms, where shelves stacked with jars and woven baskets smell of herbs, beeswax, and dried fish. Here, in the hush between stone walls, you witness another side of ancient dental care, preparation. Prevention, after all, was their best weapon against tooth rot, even if it wasn't perfect. An older steward stands by a row of baskets, carefully sorting sweet dates from harder, grittier foods. He sighs as he does so, explaining how stones in the flour mill left tiny chips of quartz that ground down teeth year after year. It was a hidden hazard that even the greatest kings could not escape. Historians still argue whether pharaohs truly ate less gritty bread, or whether their servants simply picked out the worst chunks and hoped for the best. A fringe bit of knowledge passes between the workers, that a lucky fish bone, tied in linen and placed under a pillow, could ward off a toothache. It sounds ridiculous, yet somehow you don't laugh. In a world where copper hooks and prayers were the only real choices, who wouldn't welcome a pinch of superstition? Near a window, you notice baskets lined with soft cakes soaked in honey and beer, practically melting at a touch. These were special royal foods, designed to keep the pharaoh's teeth from cracking while still giving him energy. You can imagine him chewing cautiously, trying not to set off that dreaded ache, maybe dabbing at sore gums with linen between bites. On a shelf, rows of tiny clay jars sit like guardians of the royal health. You lean closer and see them labeled with symbols for mint, thyme, frankincense, and myrrh, nature's mouthwash, ready to soothe the ruler's breath and calm infected gums. These herbs, blended with wine, created a rinse both sharp and cooling, and you picture the pharaoh swishing it before public ceremonies, praying the gods would keep his voice strong. Further down, an apprentice arranges thin copper picks and ivory toothpicks on a polished wooden tray. They gleam like a surgeon's arsenal, and you sense their double meaning: instruments of relief and instruments of terror. In the wrong hands, a copper pick could turn a simple cleaning into a nightmare. But in trained hands, it might buy the pharaoh another month of unbroken words. You notice a priest carrying a fresh roll of papyrus to record supplies. The lists are meticulous: honey, natron, barley flour, even willow bark, which was sometimes chewed to dull pain, a faint echo of modern aspirin. Historians still debate whether willow bark actually eased a toothache, but its bitterness must have given the pharaoh at least the feeling of doing something, and sometimes that was enough. On the floor, woven mats hold jars of donkey milk, a creamy, pungent liquid believed to soften swollen gums. A servant stirs one jar carefully, checking for sourness, and you feel a sympathetic shiver. Imagine warm donkey milk swirling around an infected tooth. Sweet dreams about that, right? Near the storeroom door, a small shrine holds a statue of Hathor with her gentle cow's horns, watching over every bomb and tool. She was protector of love and health, a comforting sight when your teeth felt like they were turning to dust. Someone has placed a few fresh lotus flowers in front of her, a silent wish that the next treatment might work better than the last. And in one corner, almost hidden, a bundle of tiny linen packets rests under a protective amulet. Each packet holds a single crumbling tooth, pulled from royal jaws over the years. They are to be buried with the pharaoh one day, part of the kit for the afterlife. Because a king, even in death, must stand whole, teeth and all, when meeting the gods. You pause to imagine that final moment: the pharaoh, judged by Osiris, flashing a perfect smile thanks to every tooth, saved and packed away by worried priests. A strange, sweet sort of dignity, and a reminder of how these ancient people refused to leave anything behind. As the steward finishes sorting the soft cakes, you hear him humming an old hymn about healing and protection. The melody drifts through the storeroom, mingling with the scent of honey and resin, until it seems to wrap around you like a lullaby. You step back, letting the quiet, organized calm of this place wash over your mind. Here, among herbs and honey jars, was the real front line against tooth decay. These humble, everyday efforts, a softer cake, a cleaner rinse, a prayer, mattered just as much as copper tools or solemn chants. Maybe you think that's the most human part of this story. Not the priests with bronze hooks, not even the gold bands wrapped around royal molars, but the simple determination to protect a loved one's smile with whatever means they had. And in that small, earnest hope, You feel a peace worth holding onto as you drift toward sleep. You move out of the storeroom and follow the gentle echo of sandals on polished stone into a hidden part of the palace. The pharaoh's bedchamber, draped with curtains of fine linen that flutter with each breeze from the river. Here, under painted ceilings alive with images of rebirth, the ruler rests between treatments, a living god brought low by a rotting tooth. It's quieter than you expect. Servants pad softly, tending oil lamps and sprinkling cool water to freshen the air. One holds a small cup of herbal rinse, waiting for the moment the pharaoh feels strong enough to swish it around his aching gums. You can practically sense the hush, the tense hope that maybe tonight there will be no fresh swell of pain. By the bed, an ivory stand holds yet another set of copper tools, perfectly polished, ready if the rot worsens by morning. Their gleam in the lamplight is beautiful and sinister at once, like the sword of a noble knight who might turn into a butcher. Historians still argue whether the pharaoh's personal healers were truly trained for complex extractions, or if they simply hoped the gods would guide their shaky hands. At the foot of the bed, a priest chants verses to Hathor and Sekhmet, their names woven into a soft, rhythmic murmur meant to lull the pain away. It has the cadence of a lullaby, wrapping the room in a drowsy calm. You feel your own eyelids grow heavy as you listen, the words flowing like a river through your mind. Near the headrest, an apprentice carefully wipes the pharaoh's lips with linen soaked in lotus water. That same lotus scent clings to the bedding, its sweetness trying to chase away the sharp reek of infection. You notice the king's breathing is shallow, strained, yet steadier than it was. Maybe the honey balm is helping, or maybe the soft songs are enough to carry him through the night. A fringe legend flickers across your thoughts, that priests would place small models of crocodile teeth under the pharaoh's pillow, hoping to absorb pain as he slept. The idea was that the fierce predator's strength would chase away the rot. A bedtime detail, absurd yet somehow oddly comforting. The pharaoh stirs, mumbling words you can't quite catch, and one healer steps closer to check the swollen gum. It's a raw, human moment, the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, needing help as vulnerable as any farmer with a toothache. The healer dabs more honey and frankincense paste around the broken molar, whispering a quick apology with each gentle touch. You spot another copper pick on the ivory tray, and your imagination winces at the idea of it scraping near the exposed nerve. The healer hesitates, then pulls back, deciding to wait until morning. Sometimes, even a pharaoh needs a night's rest before facing that kind of agony. A clay cup of beer stands ready, set on a low stool. Not for celebration, but as a final mouth rinse, should the pain spike again. Beer, the universal courage potion of the ancient world, helping brave hearts and failing teeth alike. The priest continues to chant, weaving in praise for the gods who guard speech and breath. Because above all, this was the terror of a ruined tooth, the loss of words, of command, of a ruler's voice. You sense how that fear hovered over the room, coiling in the shadows like a serpent. You look toward the window, where the river reflects moonlight in broken ripples. Its calm is timeless, indifferent to the pharaoh's pain, and somehow reassuring. The world will go on, the river will keep flowing, whether the pharaoh smiles or not. But to those inside this room, that one mouth, that one voice, is everything. Historians still debate if these sleepless nights changed royal policy, if a hurting pharaoh grew kinder or crueler while pain clawed at his jaw. Maybe there were moments of rage, moments of clarity, confessions whispered in feverish half-dreams to the priests who watched over him. You wish you could hear those lost secrets, carried away on lotus-scented air. One apprentice yawns, blinking back exhaustion. You sympathize. How many nights have these healers sat up, waiting for a change, praying each breath would be easier than the last. In that shared sleeplessness, you sense a kind of love. Not just obedience, but true loyalty, the same devotion you'd give any friend or family member in pain. A lamp flickers, its tiny flame steadying itself in the warm air. Around it, calm returns. The healer checks the Pharaoh's bandaged jaw one last time, and then bows deeply, slipping away into the corridor. You stay a moment longer, letting the sounds of chanting, the faint scent of herbs, and the hush of the Nile soothe you like a lullaby. And you realize, perhaps for the first time, how close to sleep these people lived, resting whenever the pain allowed, waking at the smallest sign of danger. Their world was one of endless half-dreams, half-prayers, all circling the king's battered smile. A fragile peace, kept alive by honey, hope, and the music of the river. You leave the hushed shadows of the bedchamber and step out into the early dawn, where soft light spills over the palace walls like warm honey. The air is cooler now, carrying the fresh scent of the Nile and the distant call of birds awakening. The world feels quieter here, as if holding its breath for a moment of fragile peace after nights filled with pain and prayer. You think back over the long journey you've just traveled, through copper tools, honey bombs, prayers to fierce lionesses, the hum of harps, and the tireless scribes recording every detail. It's a strange and humbling path, tracing the very human story behind the golden masks and towering monuments. You realize that beneath the grandeur, the Pharaoh was vulnerable, just like you, facing a battle fought not with armies, but with small, sharp instruments and ancient remedies. You recall the thick honey pastes, the whispered chants to Sekhmet, and the strange superstitions. Fish bones under pillows, crocodile teeth as talismans, and necklaces made from tiny animal teeth, all desperate measures to keep decay and pain at bay. It's easy to smile at the quirks, but each one speaks of a hope that ran deeper than medicine alone. The hope that the king's smile would endure, that his voice would command the world, that his power would remain unbroken. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these treatments and whether the gods truly intervened, or if survival was simply the luck of the draw. But what stands clear is the devotion poured into every cure, every prayer, every tender touch. The Pharaoh's teeth weren't just tools for eating, they were symbols of his life, his authority, and even his immortality. You breathe in the cool morning air, feeling the quiet strength of the river's endless flow. It reminds you that time carries all things away, the pains, the prayers, the tiny battles against decay. Yet some stories, like this one, persist. They live on in whispered legends and fading papyrus scrolls, reminding us that behind every crown is a human story filled with hope, fear, and a fierce determination to endure. Now, as your own eyelids grow heavy, you let the last images fade, the golden honey, the gleam of copper tools, the soft lullaby of harps and prayers. You carry with you the gentle truth that even the mightiest face struggles we all share. And as the Nile winds on, so too does the quiet courage to meet each new dawn, one breath, one smile, one tooth at a time. Let that thought drift through your mind like a soft river song as you sink deeper into rest. Tomorrow is a new day, and your smile will be waiting.